The shack stood at the edge of Leavenworth, Kansas, leaning so far to the left that most folks swore it would collapse with the next strong wind. But Willa Prescott saw something different when she looked at those weathered boards in the spring of 1877. She had arrived in town 3 days earlier with nothing but a worn carpet bag and $17 sewn into the hem of her skirt. The journey from St. Louis had been long and uncomfortable, but anything was better than staying in her uncle's house where his new wife had made it clear that Willa was an unwelcome burden. At 22 years old, she had decided that building a life alone was preferable to living where she was not wanted. The shack sat on a piece of land that nobody claimed anymore. The previous owner had died 2 winters back, and his relatives back east had never bothered to come collect the property. It was too far from the main part of town to be desirable, too run down to fetch any real price, and the soil around it was rocky and stubborn. But it had 4 walls and most of a roof, and when Willa asked around about it at the general store, the proprietor had laughed and told her she could have it if she could make anything of it. She moved in that very afternoon with a borrowed hammer and a box of nails she purchased with 2 of her precious dollars. The inside smelled of dust and abandonment, and she could see daylight through gaps in the walls. The floor was dirt, packed hard over the years, and there was no furniture except for a broken chair with 2 legs missing. But it was hers, or as close to hers as anything had ever been. That first night she lay on the hard ground wrapped in her only blanket and listened to the wind howl through the cracks. She did not cry, though part of her wanted to. Instead, she made plans. She would patch the walls first, then work on making the place weatherproof before summer turned to fall. She would find work in town, save every penny, and slowly transform this forgotten place into a real home. The next morning, she woke with the sunrise and got to work. She stuffed old newspapers and strips of fabric from a worn petticoat into the largest gaps in the walls. She swept the floor until her arms ached. She scrubbed the one grimy window with water she hauled from the creek a quarter-mile away until she could actually see through it. By midday, the place looked marginally better, though it was still obviously a wreck. She walked into town to look for work, her best dress brushed clean and her dark hair pinned neatly under her bonnet. Leavenworth was a bustling place, swollen with soldiers from the nearby fort, traders heading west, and settlers looking for opportunity. But work for a single woman without references was hard to come by. The hotel said they had no positions. The restaurant told her to come back in a month. The dress shop owner looked her up and down with suspicion and said she only hired local girls. By the third rejection, Willa's determination was wavering, but she kept her chin up. She finally found a possibility at a laundry run by a stern woman named Mrs. Kowalski, who agreed to pay her by the piece. The work was backbreaking, standing over steaming tubs of water for hours, scrubbing other people's clothes until her hands were red and raw. But it was money, and money meant survival. She fell into a routine over the next several weeks. Wake before dawn, haul water, work at the laundry until her back screamed in protest, collect her wages, buy the cheapest food she could find, and return to the shack to continue her improvements. She bought boards one at a time when she could afford them and learned to nail them in place herself. She traded some of her labor for a bag of lime and patched holes in the walls. She found a cast iron pot someone had thrown away and scoured it clean to cook her meager meals. The shack was still humble, still obviously the poorest dwelling on the outskirts of town, but it was becoming something. It was becoming hers. The Cowboy first appeared on a Tuesday morning in late June when the heat was already rising in shimmering waves from the ground. Willa was outside, trying to figure out how to repair a section of the roof that had partially caved in during a recent storm. She had climbed up on a rickety ladder and was examining the damage when she heard a horse approaching. She turned, shading her eyes against the bright sun, and saw a man on a dusty brown mare. He was tall in the saddle, wearing a hat that had seen better days and a shirt that might have once been blue but had faded to something closer to gray. He had a few days of stubble on his jaw and eyes that were a surprising shade of green even from a distance. He stopped his horse a respectful distance from her property and tipped his hat. "Morning, miss." Willa climbed down from the ladder, suddenly aware of how she must look in her oldest dress with her hair escaping from its pins. "Morning. Didn't know anyone was living out here," he said, his voice carrying a slight drawl that suggested he was from somewhere south of Kansas. "Thought this place was abandoned." "It was," Willa said, brushing dust from her skirt. "Now it is not." He looked at the shack, taking in its obvious disrepair, then looked back at her. There was something in his expression that was not quite pity, but close to concern. "You fixing this place up yourself?" "I am." "That is a lot of work for one person." Willa straightened her shoulders. "I am managing." He nodded slowly, and she thought he might say something more, but instead he touched his hat again and said, "Well, good luck to you, miss." Then he rode on toward town. She watched him go, feeling oddly unsettled. Most people who passed by her shack either ignored it completely or stared with open curiosity before moving on. He had been different somehow, though she could not quite put her finger on why. She did not think about him again until 3 days later, when she was hauling water from the creek and found him there, letting his horse drink. Up close, she could see he was probably around 26 or 27, with a weathered face that suggested he spent most of his time outdoors. There was a scar along his jaw, thin and white, and his hands on the reins were calloused and strong. "We meet again," he said with a slight smile. "So it seems." She bent to fill her bucket, acutely aware of his presence. "Name is Blake Winters," he said. "I work at the Double R Ranch about 5 miles west of here." She hesitated, then decided there was no harm in giving her name. "Willa Prescott." "Pleased to meet you properly, Miss Prescott." He paused, then added, "If you do not mind my saying that Roof is going to be trouble come fall. The rains here can be fierce." "I know," Willa said more sharply than she intended. "I plan to fix it." "Did not mean any offense," Blake said mildly, "just making an observation." Willa felt her cheeks heat. "I apologize. I am not used to people commenting on my situation. I imagine folks in town have plenty to say." "They do." She lifted her full bucket. "But I have learned to ignore them." He watched her struggle with the weight of the water for a moment, then said, "Let me help you with that. I can manage." "I am sure you can," he said, already dismounting. "But there is no sense in you hauling that heavy bucket when I am right here and heading in the same direction anyway." Before she could protest further, he had taken the bucket from her hands. His fingers brushed hers briefly, and she felt a strange flutter in her stomach that she firmly ignored. They walked back to the shack in silence, his horse following behind. When they reached her door, he set the bucket down carefully and looked at the building with an assessing eye. "You have done a lot of work already," he said. "Place looks better than it did last week." "Thank you." Willa was not sure what else to say. She was not accustomed to compliments or help. Blake seemed to hesitate, then said, "I've got Sunday off this week. If you want, I could come by and help you with that roof. Would not take long with 2 people, and I have done plenty of roofing work." Willa stared at him. "Why would you do that?" He shrugged. "Seems like you could use a hand, and I do not mind helping." "I cannot pay you. Did not ask you to." She wanted to refuse. She wanted to tell him she did not need anyone's charity. But the truth was that the roof was beyond her current skill, and she was terrified that it would not hold through the winter. Pride was one thing, but freezing to death was another. "All right," she said quietly. "Thank you." He smiled then, a real smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "I will be here Sunday morning then." True to his word, Blake appeared on Sunday, just after dawn, with a bag of tools and extra materials. Willa had been up for an hour already, too nervous and uncertain to sleep. She had tidied the shack as best she could and changed into her second-best dress, then felt foolish and changed back into her work clothes. He got right to work without any preamble, climbing up on the roof to examine the damage more closely. Willa handed him tools and materials as he asked for them, and gradually found herself climbing up beside him to help. The work was hot and difficult, but Blake was patient, showing her how to position the boards and where to nail them for the strongest hold. They worked through the morning, speaking little but developing an easy rhythm. When the sun was high overhead, Willa climbed down and brought out the simple lunch she had prepared, bread and cheese and water, worried it was not enough. But Blake accepted it gratefully and ate like it was a feast. "You are good at this," Willa said, gesturing to the roof. "The carpentry, I mean." "My father was a builder," Blake said, "before the war. He taught me and my brothers everything he knew." "You have brothers?" "Two, both older. They stayed back in Tennessee when I headed west, wanted to work the family land." He took a drink of water. "What about you? Any family?" Willa looked down at her hands. "My parents died when I was 12. Yellow fever. I went to live with my uncle in St. Louis, but when he remarried, his new wife did not want me there. So I came here. That must have been hard. It was necessary." She met his eyes. "I would rather build my own life than live on someone else's grudging charity." He nodded slowly. "I can't understand that." They finished the roof by mid-afternoon. It was not perfect, but it was solid and would hold against the weather. Willa stood in the yard, looking up at it, and felt something loosen in her chest. This place was starting to feel less like a desperate gamble and more like an actual possibility. "Thank you," she said to Blake. "I cannot tell you how much this means." "It was no trouble," he said, packing up his tools. Then he hesitated, and she saw something uncertain cross his face. "Would it be all right if I came by again? Maybe helped with some of the other repairs?" Willa knew she should say no. She did not know this man, and she had promised herself she would rely only on herself. But there was something about him that felt steady and genuine, and the truth was that she liked his company more than she wanted to admit. "Yes," she said. "That would be all right." Blake started coming by every Sunday after that, and sometimes on weekday evenings when he finished early at the ranch. Together, they reinforced the walls, built a proper door to replace the hanging blanket she had been using, and constructed a small porch that kept the direct rain from flooding under the door. He brought scraps of wood from the ranch that would have been thrown away anyway, and she provided meals that gradually became more elaborate as she grew more confident in her cooking. They talked while they worked, slowly sharing pieces of their lives. Blake had come west 3 years earlier, looking for work and adventure after spending too many years trying to rebuild a Tennessee farm that the war had left in ruins. He was good with horses, practical with tools, and had a dry sense of humor that often caught Willa off guard and made her laugh. Willa found herself opening up in ways she had not expected, telling him about her childhood before her parents died, about the books she loved to read, about her dreams of maybe one day having a real house with glass windows and a garden. Blake listened without judgment, and gradually she realized she felt more comfortable with him than she had with anyone in years. The town began to notice, of course. Mrs. Kowalski at the laundry made pointed comments about cowboys and their reputations. The women at the general store whispered when Willa came in to buy supplies. But Willa held her head high and ignored them. Let them talk. She knew there was nothing improper happening, and even if there were, it was none of their business. As summer deepened into July and August, the shack continued to transform. Blake helped her build a small chicken coop, and she bought 3 hens with her saved wages, which meant fresh eggs most mornings. He showed her how to construct proper shelves on the walls, and she arranged her few possessions on them with pride. The dirt floor was still dirt, but she swept it religiously and kept it packed smooth. It was during one of those long summer evenings, when they were sitting on the porch watching the sunset in streaks of orange and gold, that Willa realized her feelings for Blake had shifted into something more than friendship. She watched his profile as he talked about a difficult horse he was training, and her heart did something complicated in her chest. The realization terrified her. She had worked so hard to build this independent life, to prove she did not need anyone. Falling in love seemed like a betrayal of everything she had promised herself, and yet she could not help the way she felt when he smiled at her, or the warmth that spread through her when he said her name. Blake seemed to sense the change too, though neither of them spoke of it directly. He started finding more reasons to visit, showing up even on days when there was no work to be done. He brought her wildflowers once, looking almost embarrassed when he handed them over, saying he had seen them on the ride over and thought she might like them. She pressed them between the pages of her only book and looked at them every night before she slept. In September, the weather began to shift, bringing cooler nights and the first hints of fall. Willa had been in the shack for nearly 5 months, and it had become something she never imagined that first night when she lay on the cold ground. The walls were straight and solid. The roof was sound. She had a bed frame that Blake had built, and a mattress stuffed with straw that was surprisingly comfortable. She had curtains on the window, made from fabric she bought with her laundry wages. It was still small and simple, but it was warm and dry and utterly hers. One evening, Blake brought over a small stove he had found at an estate sale in town. It was old but functional, and he spent hours setting it up properly with a pipe going through the roof. When he finally got it working, he built a fire in it, and they stood together watching the flames through the grate. "Now you will be warm all winter," he said. Willa looked at him, at this man who had shown up months ago and had somehow become the most important person in her world. "Blake," she said quietly, "why do you do all this? Really?" He was silent for a long moment, and she could see him choosing his words carefully. "When I first saw you up on that ladder, trying to fix that roof by yourself, I thought you were either crazy or the bravest person I had ever met." He turned to face her fully. "Then I got to know you, and I realized it was both. You were building a home out of nothing because you refused to give up. And I guess I wanted to be part of that. Part of what you were building." "Just the house?" Willa asked, her heart pounding. "No," Blake said softly. "Not just the house." He reached out and took her hand, his rough fingers gentle on hers. Willa looked down at their joined hands, feeling something fundamental shift inside her. "I have fallen in love with you, Willa," he said. "I tried not to. I know you value your independence, and I did not want to complicate things. But I cannot help how I feel." Willa felt tears prick her eyes. "I thought I needed to do everything alone," she whispered. "I thought needing someone meant I was weak." "You are the strongest person I know," Blake said. "And needing someone does not change that. It just means you are human." She looked up at him then, at his honest face and steady eyes, and made a choice. She stepped closer and kissed him, tentative and nervous. He responded immediately, his arms coming around her, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Willa felt truly safe. They stood like that for a long time, holding each other in the warmth of the little shack, while the stove crackled and outside the prairie stretched away in every direction. Over the following weeks, their relationship deepened. Blake was courting her properly now, which amused Willa, given how much time they had already spent alone together. But he took her to church socials and walked with her through town, and gradually the gossip shifted from scandalized to intrigued. A few of the women even started being friendly, as if Willa had finally done something they could understand. Blake proposed on a crisp October afternoon when the leaves were turning and the air smelled of wood smoke. They were working on building a small addition to the shack, another room that could serve as a proper bedroom, and he suddenly stopped hammering and turned to her. "Marry me," he said. Willa nearly dropped the board she was holding. "What?" "Marry me," he repeated. "I know this is not fancy, and I should probably have planned something better, but I cannot wait anymore. I want to spend my life with you. I want to help you build this home and fill it with love and make it everything you dreamed of." Willa set down the board carefully, her hands trembling. 6 months ago, she had arrived in Leavenworth with nothing but determination and fear. She had sworn she would never depend on anyone, never let herself be vulnerable again. But Blake had shown her that love was not about dependence. It was about partnership, about choosing to build something together that neither could build alone. Yes, she said, and then louder, yes, I will marry you. He whooped and picked her up, spinning her around until she was dizzy and laughing. When he set her down, he kissed her thoroughly, and Willa felt happiness bubble up inside her like a spring. They were married 3 weeks later in the small church in Leavenworth. Willa wore a new dress she had sewn herself from pale blue fabric, and Blake wore his best clothes with his hair slicked back and his boots polished. Mrs. Kowalski came to the wedding, along with several of the ranch hands Blake worked with and a handful of townspeople. It was small and simple, but when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Willa felt like the richest woman in the world. They spent their wedding night in the shack, which Blake had decorated with lanterns and wildflowers. He had even built a proper bed frame with a real mattress he had bought in town. Willa had made new curtains and swept everything until it gleamed. It was still just a small house on the edge of town, but it was theirs together now. Blake was gentle with her, patient and loving, and Willa discovered that physical intimacy with someone you loved was something beautiful and right. They lay together afterward, his arms around her, and talked about their future. Blake wanted to save money to buy their own land eventually, maybe start a small horse ranch. Willa wanted to expand the house, add more rooms, plant a real garden in the spring. They dreamed together, spinning plans in the darkness, and Willa felt a contentment she had never known was possible. Winter came, and the little shack proved its worth. The stove kept them warm even on the coldest nights, and the roof Blake had repaired held strong against snow and ice. Willa continued working at the laundry, though less frequently now that she had Blake's income to supplement their funds. She spent her time making their home more comfortable, sewing curtains and quilts, learning to cook more elaborate meals on the little stove. Blake would come home from the ranch tired and dusty, and she would have dinner waiting. They would eat together, talking about their days, and then sit by the stove while she mended and he carved pieces of wood, slowly building furniture for their home. Sometimes they would read aloud to each other from the books they borrowed from the traveling library. Sometimes they would simply sit in comfortable silence, enjoying each other's presence. The townspeople's attitudes continued to soften. Willa was no longer the strange woman living alone in a shack. She was Blake Winter's wife, which apparently made her respectable. She made friends with some of the other ranch wives, and they taught her their recipes and sewing techniques. She was slowly becoming part of the community, though she never forgot those early days when she had been utterly alone. Spring arrived with a rush of green growth and warm winds. Blake helped Willa plant her garden, turning over the rocky soil and amending it with manure from the ranch horses. She planted vegetables and herbs, carefully tending them every day. She also planted wildflowers along the front of the house, wanting beauty as well as practicality. In April, Willa realized she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks, but had been afraid to hope. When she finally told Blake, he was so excited he could barely speak. He picked her up carefully, as if she were made of glass, and kissed her with a tenderness that made her cry. "We are going to have a baby," he kept saying, wonder in his voice. "We are going to be parents." Willa cried into his shoulder, overwhelmed with joy and fear and love. This small house that no one had wanted was going to hold a family. The home she had built from nothing was going to be filled with the sound of a child. Blake became even more protective of her, insisting she not work too hard, bringing her treats from town, constantly asking how she felt. Willa found it both endearing and occasionally exasperating, but she loved him for his concern. She continued her work at the laundry for another month before the physical demands became too much, and then she focused on preparing for the baby. She sewed tiny clothes from scraps of fabric, her stitches careful and precise. Blake built a cradle from smooth wood, sanding it for hours until there was not a single rough edge. They turned the small addition they had started building into a nursery, painting the walls white and hanging cheerful curtains. The pregnancy was not always easy. Willa was sick most mornings for the first few months, and the summer heat made her uncomfortable and swollen. But Blake was patient and supportive, rubbing her aching back and fetching her cool water. He would talk to her belly in the evenings, telling their unborn child about the world they were going to enter, and Willa would rest her hands on her growing stomach and feel utterly content. The baby came in late October, during the first cold snap of the season. Willa's labor started in the middle of the night, and Blake rode frantically to fetch the midwife. Mrs. Patterson, a sturdy woman who had delivered half the babies in Leavenworth, arrived quickly and took charge of the situation with calm efficiency. Blake was terrified, pacing outside while Willa labored, occasionally being allowed in to hold her hand when the contractions were at their worst. Willa had never experienced pain like this, waves of it that stole her breath and made her cry out. But between contractions, she focused on Blake's face, on his worried eyes and strong hands, and found the strength to keep going. Just before dawn, their son was born. He came into the world with a lusty cry that Blake said he could hear from outside. Mrs. Patterson cleaned him quickly and placed him in Willa's arms, and Willa looked down at this tiny, perfect person and felt her heart expand in ways she did not know were possible. "He is beautiful," Blake whispered, sitting beside her on the bed, his arm around her shoulders. "You are amazing. You did so well." The baby had Blake's green eyes and a shock of dark hair. He was small but healthy, with a strong grip and powerful lungs. They named him Benjamin, after Blake's father who had died years before. Little Benjamin Winters, born in a house that had almost fallen down, to parents who had found each other by chance. Those first few weeks with a newborn were exhausting and overwhelming. Benjamin needed to be fed constantly, and Willa was sore and tired from the birth. But Blake was wonderful, changing diapers and walking the floor with the baby when he cried at night, letting Willa rest as much as possible. Slowly, they found their rhythm as parents, learning Benjamin's different cries and needs. The house that had once held only Willa now held a family. Blake would come home from work and scoop up his son, talking to him about the horses and the ranch. Willa would nurse Benjamin while looking out the window at her garden, now dormant for winter but full of promise for spring. The small rooms that she had worked so hard to build echoed with the sounds of life and love. That winter was harder than the previous one, not because of the cold, but because of the demands of caring for an infant. Benjamin was colicky for a while, crying for hours no matter what they tried. Willa and Blake took turns walking with him, exhausted and frustrated, but never giving up. The little shack that had once been so quiet now rang with baby cries and tired conversations and lullabies sung at 3 a.m. But there were beautiful moments too. Benjamin's first smile, which came on a snowy January morning and made both parents laugh with delight. The way he would calm when Blake sang to him in his low, rumbling voice. The feeling of his small weight in Willa's arms as she rocked him to sleep. These moments made all the exhaustion worthwhile. As Benjamin grew, so did their lives. Blake had been saving every extra penny, and in the spring of 1879, he came home with incredible news. The ranch owner was selling off a portion of his land, and Blake had saved enough for a down payment. They could own their own property, 60 acres with a creek running through it, good grazing land for horses. Willa held Benjamin on her hip while Blake explained his plans. He would continue working at the ranch for now, but slowly build up their own horse stock. Eventually, he could work for himself, breeding and training horses. They could build a bigger house on the new land, though they would keep the shack too, maybe use it for storage or for ranch hands eventually. "What do you think?" Blake asked, watching her face anxiously. Willa looked around the small house she had claimed when she had nothing, the house that had become a home through hard work and love. Then she looked at her husband and her son, at the life they had built together. "I think it sounds perfect," she said. Over the next several years, their lives expanded in ways Willa could never have imagined that first desperate night in the abandoned shack. They bought the land and Blake began building his horse herd. He had a gift for it, a natural way with animals that made him sought after as a trainer. People started coming from surrounding counties to buy horses that Blake had trained, willing to pay good prices for his expertise. They built a new house on their land, a real house with multiple rooms and wooden floors and glass in all the windows. But they kept the shack too. and Willa made sure it was maintained. Sometimes she would go there alone, walking through the small rooms, remembering the terrified young woman who had claimed it with nothing but determination. That shack represented something important to her, a reminder that she was capable of surviving anything. Benjamin grew into a curious, energetic toddler with his father's green eyes and his mother's determination. He loved following Blake around the ranch, toddling after him and trying to help with the horses. Willa would watch them together, her heart full, amazed that this was her life. In the summer of 1881, Willa gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Margaret. She was quieter than Benjamin had been as a baby, with Willa's dark hair and a solemn way of looking at the world. Benjamin was fascinated by his little sister, always wanting to help take care of her, bringing her toys and patting her head gently. The new house was filled with the chaos and joy of family life. Blake had hired 2 ranch hands to help with the growing horse business, young men who ate at their table and became part of their extended family. Willa cooked large meals and kept the house running, cared for the children, and managed the garden that had expanded into something impressive. She had also learned to preserve food, and their cellar was filled with jars of vegetables and fruits she had canned. Life was not always easy. There were hard years when the weather was bad and money was tight. There were illnesses, including a terrifying week when Benjamin had a high fever and they thought they might lose him. There were disagreements between Willa and Blake about money, or the children, or the running of the ranch. But they worked through everything together, their love deepening with each challenge they overcame. Willa sometimes thought about that first summer in the shack, when she had been so determined to do everything alone. She had been strong then, but she was stronger now, she realized. Not because she could survive on her own, but because she had learned that true strength came from building something with someone else, from allowing yourself to be vulnerable and loved. Blake would sometimes find her at the old shack, standing in the doorway looking at the small space. He would put his arm around her and say, "Remember when this was all we had?" "It was enough," Willa would say, "because it was ours." By 1885, their ranch was one of the most successful in the area. Blake had developed a reputation that extended well beyond Leavenworth, and they were financially comfortable in a way that would have seemed impossible years earlier. They had expanded the house again, adding more bedrooms and a proper parlor. Willa had furniture she had chosen herself, beautiful things that made her proud. But she never forgot where she had started, and she made sure her children knew the story. She would take them to the old shack and tell them how she had arrived in Leavenworth with nothing, how she had claimed this forgotten place and made it into something. She told them about their father appearing on his horse, about how he had helped her build a home and then helped her build a life. "The important thing," she would tell them, "is that you never give up on yourself. I could have stayed in St. Louis, miserable and dependent on my uncle's charity. Instead, I chose to build my own life, even though it was hard and scary. And then your father came along and made it even better, not because I needed rescuing, but because we chose to build something together." Benjamin and Margaret listened to these stories with wide eyes, running their small hands over the weathered walls of the shack, trying to imagine their capable, confident mother as a desperate young woman with nowhere to go. In the fall of 1886, Willa gave birth to their third child, another son they named Thomas. He was a happy baby who rarely cried, content to be passed around among his siblings and parents. Benjamin, now 7, was old enough to be a real help, fetching things for his mother and watching Margaret while Willa nursed the baby. Margaret, at 5, was developing into a thoughtful child who loved helping in the garden and learning to cook. The house was full of noise and life and love. Blake's business continued to thrive, and they were able to hire more help, including a young woman to assist Willa with the housework and children. But Willa still did most things herself, finding satisfaction in the work of maintaining her home and caring for her family. Blake was as devoted a husband as ever, still bringing her wildflowers sometimes, still sitting with her in the evenings to talk about their days. Their love had matured into something deep and steady, a partnership built on mutual respect and genuine affection. They still had disagreements occasionally, but they had learned to work through them with patience and understanding. One evening in the summer of 1887, they sat together on the porch of the big house, watching the sun set over their land. The children were in bed, finally asleep after the usual chaos of bedtime. The ranch was quiet except for the sounds of horses in the distance and crickets in the grass. "Do you ever regret it?" Blake asked suddenly. "Marrying me, I mean. Giving up that independence you fought so hard for?" Willa turned to look at him, surprised. "Never," she said firmly. "I did not give up my independence, Blake. I chose to share my life with you. There is a difference. I just want to make sure you are happy," he said, "that this life is what you want." Willa reached over and took his hand. "When I was living in that shack alone, I thought I knew what happiness was. I thought it was about not needing anyone, about proving I could survive on my own. But you taught me that real happiness is about connection, about building something with someone you love." She squeezed his fingers. "I am happier than I ever dreamed possible. And it is because of you." Blake brought her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Willa Winters. And you are what made my house into a home," she replied. They sat together as the stars came out, hands joined, surrounded by the life they had built together. In the distance, the old shack stood at the edge of their property, a reminder of beginnings and the courage it took to claim a life worth living. As the years continued to pass, the Winters family became a fixture in the Leavenworth community. Willa was respected not just as Blake's wife, but as a woman of substance in her own right. She helped organize church socials and was known for taking in women who needed help, giving them work on the ranch or helping them find positions in town. She never forgot what it felt like to be desperate and alone, and she made sure that any woman in similar circumstances had someone to turn to. Blake's horse ranch continued to flourish. By 1890, he employed 6 full-time hands and had horses that were known throughout Kansas and into neighboring states. He was proud of what he had built, but he was even prouder of his family. Benjamin was growing into a responsible young man who loved working with the horses as much as his father did. Margaret was proving to be artistically gifted, always drawing or painting, her works covering the walls of the house. Thomas was still young, but already showing signs of his father's way with animals. In 1891, Willa gave birth to their 4th and final child, a daughter they named Alice. At 36, Willa found this pregnancy harder than the previous ones, and the birth was difficult. But Alice arrived healthy and strong, and Willa recovered well, if slowly. Blake fussed over her for weeks, insisting she rest and let the hired help manage the house. "I am fine," Willa kept telling him, though secretly she was grateful for his concern. "You are the most important person in my world," Blake would respond. "I will fuss if I want to." With 4 children, the house was constantly busy and often chaotic. But it was a good chaos, Willa thought, full of laughter and arguments and the everyday business of living. She loved watching her children grow, seeing pieces of herself and Blake in each of them. She loved the way Benjamin was patient with his younger siblings, how Margaret could lose herself in her art for hours, how Thomas had an endless curiosity about everything, how baby Alice smiled at everyone who held her. The old shack remained standing, now truly used for storage but still maintained. Sometimes Willa would take her daughters there and tell them the story of how she had claimed it, emphasizing that they should never let anyone tell them they were not capable of building the life they wanted. Margaret loved these stories and even painted a picture of the shack that hung in the main house, a reminder of their family's humble beginnings. By the mid-1890s, Blake had achieved his dream of working entirely for himself. The ranch was successful enough that he no longer needed outside employment. He and Benjamin worked together training horses, and it was clear that Benjamin would eventually take over the business. Margaret had no interest in ranching, but had begun selling her paintings, developing her own small income and reputation. Thomas and Alice were still young, but already showing their own distinct personalities and interests. Willa was deeply content with her life. She had built a home, raised children, created a family with a man she loved deeply. The scared young woman who had arrived in Leavenworth with $17 and a carpetbag seemed like a different person sometimes, though Willa never forgot her. That woman's courage and determination had made everything else possible. One spring day in 1897, Willa walked out to the old shack alone. She was 42 now, and her body showed the years of hard work and childbearing, but she was healthy and strong, and she felt like she had lived a full life. She stood in the doorway of the shack, looking at the small space that had once been her entire world. She could almost see her younger self there, determined and frightened, patching walls and dreaming of a better future. She could see Blake as he had been that first day, stopping his horse to check on the strange woman trying to fix an impossible roof. She could see the two of them working together, falling in love, building something neither could have built alone. "Thank you," she whispered to that younger version of herself. "Thank you for being brave enough to start." That evening, she told Blake she wanted to do something with the shack, something more meaningful than just using it for storage. "What did you have in mind?" he asked. "I want to offer it to women who need a place to stay," Willa said. "The way I did. Women who are leaving bad situations or starting over. We could fix it up properly, make it comfortable, and let them stay there rent-free until they get on their feet." Blake considered this. "It is a good idea," he said slowly. "But that shack is part of our history, our story." "Exactly," Willa said. "And the best way to honor that story is to help other women write their own." Blake smiled and pulled her close. "You are an extraordinary woman, Willa Winters." "I am a woman who had help when she needed it," Willa corrected, "and now I want to provide that for others." They renovated the shack over the next several months, Blake and Benjamin doing most of the physical work, while Willa furnished it with good, sturdy furniture and supplies. They put out word through the church and around town that the shack was available for any woman who needed temporary housing. The first woman to use it was a widow named Sarah, who had lost her husband and her home in the same month. She stayed in the shack for 3 months while she worked and saved money, and Willa helped her find permanent housing in town. After Sarah came others, a steady stream of women starting over, and Willa made sure they all felt welcomed and supported. The old shack became known as a place of new beginnings, and Willa took great satisfaction in knowing that the place where her own life had truly started was now helping others do the same. Blake would sometimes shake his head in amazement at his wife's endless capacity for generosity, but he supported her fully, both financially and emotionally. As the new century approached, the Winters family had become one of the most respected in the county. Benjamin was 22 and engaged to a nice young woman from town. Margaret was 20 and had sold several paintings to collectors in Kansas City. Thomas was 16 and still deciding what he wanted to do with his life. Alice was 9 and showed signs of being as determined and independent as her mother. Blake was in his early 50s now, his hair graying at the temples, but still strong and vital. He and Willa would sit on their porch in the evenings, as they had done for years, watching the sun set over land they owned, surrounded by the life they had built. "Do you remember the first time I helped you with that roof?" Blake asked one evening. "Of course," Willa said. "I was so suspicious of you. I could not understand why you would want to help." "I fell in love with you that day," Blake said, "watching you work so hard, so determined to make something of that wreck of a building. I knew you were special." Willa leaned her head on his shoulder. "You made it warmer," she said softly. "The shack, I mean. It was just walls and a roof until you came along. You made it feel like a home." "We made it together," Blake corrected. "You built the foundation, and I just added to it." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars came out, the same stars that had shone down on them that first night they had held each other in the small shack. So much had changed since then, but the core of what they had remained the same. Two people who had chosen to build a life together, who had worked and loved and created something beautiful out of very little. In 1899, Benjamin married his sweetheart Emily in a ceremony at the ranch. Willa watched her eldest son pledge his life to another person, and felt the circle of life continuing. Blake stood beside her, his arm around her waist, and she knew he was feeling the same mixture of joy and nostalgia. "We are getting old," she whispered to him. "Speak for yourself." He whispered back with a smile. "I am just getting started." But they were older, Willa thought, and she was grateful for every year they had been given together. Margaret married the following year a young lawyer from Topeka who appreciated her artistic nature. They moved to the city, but visited often, and Willa was glad to see her daughter happy and pursuing her passion. Thomas decided he wanted to be a veterinarian and began studying with the local doctor who also treated animals. Alice was growing into a spirited young woman who reminded everyone of her mother. The house that had once been filled with small children now echoed with young adult conversations and plans for the future. Willa continued her work helping women in need, and the shack saw a steady stream of residents over the years. Each woman who stayed there added to its story, and sometimes former residents would come back to visit and thank Willa for giving them a chance to start over. These moments meant more to Willa than almost anything else, the knowledge that her own difficult beginning had been transformed into help for others. Blake's health remained strong well into his 50s, but in 1903, he was thrown from a particularly difficult horse and broke several ribs. The injury healed, but it was a reminder that they were not young anymore. Willa fussed over him the way he had always fussed over her, and Blake complained good-naturedly while secretly enjoying her attention. "We have had a good life," he said one evening as he recovered, Willa sitting beside him with her mending. "We have," she agreed, "and we are not done yet." "No," he said, reaching for her hand. "Not yet." They watched their family continue to grow. Benjamin and Emily had their first child in 1903, a boy they named Blake after his grandfather. Willa held her first grandchild and felt a wave of emotion so strong it nearly overwhelmed her. This tiny person was part of her legacy, part of the family she and Blake had created from nothing. Margaret had a daughter in 1904, a girl named Willa who had her grandmother's dark hair and serious eyes. Thomas finished his veterinary training and set up practice in Leavenworth, quickly becoming the most trusted animal doctor in the area. Alice, at 22, was courting a schoolteacher from town, much to her parents' amusement. The ranch continued to thrive under Benjamin's management, and Blake was able to step back and take a more advisory role. He spent his time with his grandchildren, teaching them about horses the way he had taught his own children. Willa loved watching him with the little ones, seeing the same patience and love he had always shown. In 1905, Alice married her schoolteacher, and they had a small ceremony at the ranch. Willa watched her youngest daughter, her baby, pledge her life to another person, and felt the bitter sweetness of watching children grow up and leave. But she was proud of all her children, proud of the people they had become. That fall, Blake fell ill with pneumonia. It came on suddenly, and despite Thomas's care and the best doctor they could find, he grew steadily worse. Willa stayed by his bedside for days, holding his hand, talking to him, refusing to accept that she might lose him. "You cannot leave me," she told him one night, tears streaming down her face. "We have more life to live together." Blake squeezed her hand weakly. "I have loved every minute with you," he said, his voice hoarse. "Every single minute from that first day I saw you on that ladder." "Please fight," Willa begged. "Please do not give up." "I am trying," he said. "But Willa, if I do not make it, I need you to know something. You made my life worth living. You and our children and the home we built together. That shack you claim became the foundation for everything good in my life." "Stop talking like you are saying goodbye," Willa said fiercely. "You are going to get better." Blake smiled weakly. "I hope so, but if I do not, promise me you will keep living fully. Keep helping those women at the shack. Keep being the amazing person you are." "I promise," Willa whispered. "But you are going to be fine. You have to be." Blake fought the illness for another week, and gradually, miraculously, he began to improve. The fever broke, and his breathing eased. By the end of October, he was weak but recovering. sitting up in bed and complaining about being coddled. Willa cried with relief, holding him carefully, thanking whatever powers had seen fit to let her keep him. Blake held her back, and they sat together in the room they had shared for so many years, grateful for the gift of more time. Blake's recovery was slow, and he was never quite as strong as he had been before the illness. But he was alive, and that was what mattered. He spent more time resting, less time working, content to watch his family and his ranch continue without his constant input. In 1907, Benjamin and Emily had their third child, a daughter. Margaret and her husband had two children now, both girls. Thomas married a young woman he had met while treating her family's livestock, and they were expecting their first child. Alice and her husband had a son, named Blake after his grandfather, which made the elder Blake tear up when he learned of it. Willa, at 52, was a grandmother many times over, and she loved every minute of it. The big house was often filled with grandchildren, their laughter and noise bringing life to every room. She would watch Blake with the little ones and feel her heart swell with love and gratitude. The old shack continued its mission of helping women in need. Over the years, dozens of women had stayed there, and many had gone on to build successful lives. Some stayed in Leavenworth, becoming part of the community. Others moved on to new places, carrying the memory of the little house that had given them a chance. Willa had started keeping a book of names, all the women who had stayed in the shack, so that their stories would not be forgotten. She would write down what little each woman wanted to share about where they came from and where they were going. The book was a testament to courage and new beginnings, and it was one of Willa's most treasured possessions. In the spring of 1909, Blake and Willa celebrated their 31st wedding anniversary. Benjamin organized a party at the ranch, and all their children and grandchildren came. Friends and neighbors gathered to celebrate the couple who had built so much together, who had become pillars of the community through hard work and generosity. Willa looked around at the gathered crowd, at her children and grandchildren, at the life she and Blake had created, and felt overwhelmed with gratitude. She thought about that young woman who had arrived in Leavenworth with nothing, who had claimed a falling down shack because it was better than giving up. She thought about Blake appearing on his horse, offering help when she had been too proud to ask for it. "What are you thinking about?" Blake asked, his arm around her waist. "Everything," Willa said. "How far we have come. How lucky I am." "We are both lucky," Blake said. "We found each other when we needed each other most." "You made my shack into a home," Willa said, echoing words she had said years before. "You made my life worth living," Blake replied. They stood together surrounded by family and friends, two people who had built something extraordinary out of very little, who had proven that love and determination could create miracles. The shack stood at the edge of the property, still there, still serving its purpose, a reminder of where everything had started. As the sun set on their anniversary celebration, painting the sky in brilliant colors, Willa leaned against her husband and felt completely content. She had built a home in a shack no one else wanted, and Blake had found her there and made it feel warmer. Together, they had created a life rich with love, family, and purpose. And that, Willa thought, was the best kind of miracle there was. The years that followed were gentle ones, filled with the everyday joys and sorrows of life. Blake's health remained fragile, but he had many good years still ahead of him. They spent their time with grandchildren, watching the ranch continue to prosper under Benjamin's management, supporting their other children in their various endeavors. Willa continued her work with the shack until she was in her 60s, when she finally passed the responsibility to Alice, who had inherited her mother's passion for helping others. The shack itself had been rebuilt and renovated several times over the years, but they kept some of the original boards as a reminder of its history. In 1915, Blake and Willa celebrated their 37th anniversary quietly, just the two of them on the porch of their home. Blake was 70 now, his hair white and his body frail, but his mind was still sharp and his love for Willa undiminished. "We have had a good run," he said, holding her hand. "The best," Willa agreed. She was 60, her own hair gray, her hands weathered from years of work, but she felt like the luckiest woman alive. They sat together, as they had done countless times before, watching the sun set over land they had made their own, surrounded by the family they had created. The shack stood in the distance, a testament to courage and new beginnings, to a young woman who had refused to give up, and a cowboy who had helped her build something extraordinary. Blake lived until 1918, passing peacefully in his sleep at the age of 73. Willa was heartbroken, but she was also grateful for the 40 years they had shared. She mourned him deeply, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, but she also celebrated the life they had built together. She lived another 15 years, remaining active and involved in her family and community until the end. She saw the old century turn into a new one, saw automobiles replace horses, saw the world change in ways she could never have imagined when she first arrived in Leavenworth, with nothing but hope and determination. When Willa passed away in 1933 at the age of 78, she was surrounded by her children, her grandchildren, and even some great-grandchildren. The shack still stood, still serving women who needed a fresh start, a living legacy of the woman who had claimed it so many years before. At her funeral, Benjamin spoke about his mother's courage, about how she had built a home and a life from nothing. Margaret read a poem she had written about the old shack and new beginnings. Thomas talked about her generosity and how she had never forgotten what it was like to need help. Alice shared stories of the dozens of women her mother had helped over the years, some of whom had traveled back to Leavenworth to pay their respects. They buried Willa next to Blake in the small cemetery outside town, and on her headstone they inscribed the words, "She built a home and filled it with love." It was simple but true, a fitting epitome for a woman who had transformed a falling-down shack into the foundation of something extraordinary. The ranch continued for generations, run by Benjamin's children and then their children. The big house remained standing, filled with new families who added their own stories to its history. But it was the old shack that became legendary, the small building where it had all started. Decades after Willa's death, people still told the story of the young woman who had arrived with nothing and claimed a building no one wanted. They told stories of the cowboy who had stopped to help her and ended up staying for a lifetime. They told stories of love and determination, of building something beautiful out of very little, of two people who had found each other and created miracles together. The shack was eventually preserved as a historical site, maintained by the Winters family as a memorial to their remarkable matriarch. Visitors could walk through its small rooms and read the stories of Willa and Blake, of the family they had created, of the dozens of women who had found shelter and hope within its walls. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the sun set in brilliant colors over the Kansas prairie, people swore they could feel something special in that little building, a warmth that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with love, the warmth of two people who had chosen each other and built something extraordinary, the warmth of a home created from nothing but courage, determination, and hope. It was the warmth that Blake had brought to Willa's shack all those years ago, and it had never faded. It lived on in the building itself, in the family they had created, in the legacy of help and generosity they had left behind. And it would continue to live on for generations to come, a testament to the power of love and the courage it takes to build a life worth living.